This is Auschwitz in Poland. The sign reads, Arbeit macht frei, or work will set you free. It was a lie. In this concentration camp during the Holocaust, more than 1 million people died. Jews mostly, but also Poles, Gypsies, Russian prisoners of war. They were gassed, worked to death, starved, shot. It's my first time traveling outside the US. I'd never even been on a plane before, but here I am, trying to make sense of this, all of this. I had read about the Holocaust, seen movies. We watched Schindler's List before we got here, but it's not the same. Words on pages and two-dimensional images can't prepare you. Nothing can. I don't know how I'll react because, you see these things in textbooks and you hear about them in history lessons and stuff, and you never really know what you're going to expect when you're there and you're in the place. So I'm hoping that being a human is enough in this situation to kind of feel how you need to feel, and it may be overwhelming and it may be uncomfortable, but I think all of those things are perfectly fine for this, and I hope I get something out of it pretty life-changing, which I think I will. It's hard to believe anything bad ever happened here in this medieval city. It looks like a giant gingerbread neighborhood. Our guide, Christian Marks, walks us through Brandenburg with its quaint homes and shops. And then there it stands, right in the middle of town, a memorial to some 9,000 human beings murdered in gas chambers on this ground in 1940. It was the site of the Euthanasia Institution of Brandenburg. Here, Nazis and compliant physicians killed men, women, and children with physical and mental disabilities, along with elderly men and women too old to work. They murdered epileptics and anyone they deemed not useful to the state.
It was, this killing facility, as you can imagine, as you can see it now, was in the middle of a town. So the people that were living here could see every day the people were transported. I don't tell you now too much, but just to have an introduction here on this memorial. The people were transported, the people that were killed, with buses, with post buses. In the beginning they were red and later on they were gray. And these buses were recognized in the city. They were recognized in the area around the cities. They were recognized in the facilities where the people lived up to that moment. So the people after they realized what's going on. I usually say the people have to concentrate, other people have to concentrate not to become aware of what happens. They really have to concentrate.
There was a 19th century German biologist who said all politics is applied biology. The Nazis took this theory and made it real. We all watch, slack-jawed, as Christian describes how this place would sort of become a prototype for what came later on a much larger scale. Here, The Nazis pumped carbon monoxide from trucks into gas chambers. It worked really well. If you can kill 9,000, why not 90,000? Why not 1,000,000? If we had been alive then, they would have killed some of us.
I mean, I always kind of knew this day was going to be the hardest for me because it's something about, so I have multiple degenerative disabilities that I'm probably going to be wheelchair bound by the time I'm 30 or 40. I might not live a very long life, so it's, but I know that my life is worth living and that I'm worth having a life. And so it's really terrifying and saddening and honestly even humbling for me, the fact that I get to live in a time where this thought has been pushed away, because it's terrifying to think that there was a time when they just looked at people who did not have a perfect form, perfect presentation, and thought that they weren't worthy of living.
This is almost too hard to process. How could this happen, so close to where people lived and worked? They must have known. How could they not know? How could they stay silent? My father works with disabled people. Each has value and dignity in their own way.
I think about how there is evil in the world and how somehow even just the basis of life can be distorted to nothing.
About 10,000 metal faces cover the floor. It's an exhibit called Shalkahet, or Fallen Leaves, within the museum. The artist, Menashe Kadishman, dedicated the faces to the victims of war and violence.
Do you find yourself trying to step gently? Just naturally, without even thinking about it?
It was like I was watching every step I was taking, like trying to decide the best way to go, but like it felt odd because everywhere you stepped it was a face.
Within the museum, you'll find evidence of 1,700 years of German and Jewish history. Our group is focused on 12 of those years, from 1933 to 1945.
Meaning in a museum there is necessarily things you cannot show, like stories you cannot tell, because people did not have a chance to live their life.
There's too much here to see and digest in a day, but certain things strike you. A letter from Fritz Wolfsky to his brother. Wolfsky, in a deportation train with his wife and 6-month-old son, on his way to Auschwitz, tossed the letter from the train. It reads, "Don't forget us."
And that kind of reflects also the level of support for the Nazis. So if you look at election results, for instance, while there was still free,
There's a farewell letter from Martha Corrant, who, facing imminent deportation, wrote to her family that she would be committing suicide rather than face death in a concentration camp. "Have me cremated and buried alongside the parents," she writes.
population centers.
And a letter from Marianne Yoakum, written to her family on the day of her execution. She and her husband Heinz, who had already been executed, were part of a Jewish resistance group in Berlin. This is the Tower of Terror, a metaphor for loneliness and cold desperation. A sliver of light bleeds through, out of reach.
The void is like what was left, like by the people who died, and like it's like a manifestation of their suffering and of the things that we're not able to see. necessarily. But it was interesting to like be in that moment in something that exists but also doesn't, which I think that's why the word void is like the best word.
Outside the museum and throughout Berlin, there are reminders, including these, of what happened here in the 1930s and 40s when Jews were rounded up and deported. They're called Stolperstein, or stumbling stones, obstacles not so much for our feet, but for our consciences. On the stones, there are names of Jews who were dragged from their homes or businesses by the Nazis, and the dates when they were deported to concentration camps or Jewish ghettos where they later died. There are some 75,000 of these stones throughout the region, placed in front of the homes or businesses where the victims lived and worked. For me, and I think for all of us, this walk through history is starting to become real, and the most difficult part is still ahead.
At least he said the tour would be like less than an hour, which is almost like commute probably.
I feel like the town's so beautiful that like it doesn't feel like so dark because like it's so built up.
It's the same walk, the same march that prisoners wearing those horrible striped pajamas marched to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, which sits right on the edge of a residential neighborhood. All of these houses were here in 1940.
Of course, the prisoners would basically take the same walk we did off of that, a train ramp very similar, very close to where we came off, and take that same walk, suggesting that this was much more of a public event than perhaps we might imagine, that people were aware that people were coming and not necessarily going from here.
Sachsenhausen was one of the earlier and smaller camps preserved primarily for so-called enemies of the state. Political prisoners, communists, homosexuals, gypsies, and there was a Jewish section. One of the first things the prisoners would have seen in what was called Building A is the familiar message, in all of its irony, work will set you free. Many of the prisoners here were worked to death.
So, and this is the roll call square here, this semicircle. And it means every morning, before they left for work, they had to come here to be counted, so to say. And every evening or after work was over, after returning here, also they had to stand and being counted. And that could have taken a long time. And it was regardless whether it was hot, warm, cold, snowing, raining, and whatever. And it was part of the torture as well, so to say.
About 200,000 were imprisoned here between 1936 and 1945. The area for the firing squad has been preserved, along with the chimneys of the crematorium, Building Z, the final stop. A Nazi attempt at humor.
This was in particular done with Russian prisoners of war.
It is amazing when you consider what has survived here for 77 years. But then again, in the scope of human history, 77 years isn't really that long. The barbed wire, though no longer electrified, is still here. The towers where German guards armed with machine guns could fire down on anyone not working hard enough. Many of the barracks are gone and only their outlines remain. But some are still here. This is Barrack 38, which housed hundreds of Jewish prisoners. Guards were known to drown prisoners in these washtubs. This cell block housed special prisoners, priests and ministers, prisoners of war, prominent figures arrested by the Gestapo, Hitler's secret police. It was a prison within a concentration camp. The gravel shoe testing track is still here. The prisoners marched around endlessly to test leather for the German shoe industry. They marched until they collapsed. At least 30,000 people were murdered here, and the evidence remains, including the original gallows, now preserved in a museum on the site.
Those people got hanged. And there is one more thing.
We're back in Berlin, still trying to understand what we just saw in Sachsenhausen. Berlin, in all of its modern metropolitan glory, flooded with tourists who come to see, among other things, the famous Brandenburg Gate. But they come to see other things too. The stadium that held Hitler's 1936 Olympics, the exterior is unchanged. The original rings remain. It was here where a humiliated Führer watched an American black man, Jesse Owens, outrun Hitler's Aryan supermen. And tourists come here to the so-called topography of terror, built on top of what was a building where the SS and Gestapo tortured anyone they thought was withholding information. The exhibit runs along a section of the Berlin Wall. Nearby is the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, 200,000 square feet of uneven concrete slabs. The designer, Peter Eisenman, said the unevenness of the stones was meant to represent an ordered system that had lost touch with human reason.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. Like, you kind of feel trapped and I know I got lost in here.
This morning was a little hard, just pretty heavy. Just going to the concentration camp and just witnessing how big it is. I always imagined it big, but just seeing it in person just kind of sets it into reality and just makes you more aware of everything.
So far that can go. I feel like this would be a sacred place, and yet people are like playing out here, and it's a little disheartening to see that. But I don't know what to expect, and I can't see it from their standpoint.
How unfair that the Nazis had the audacity to give their victims a view. Depending on where they were within Ravensbrück concentration camp, prisoners could look across the lake and see the freedom for which they longed. An idyllic German town, a postcard. Meanwhile, within the walls, they were dying by the thousands.
Maybe on the kind of imprisonment there, I mentioned already that it could be a place for punishment. That was on the one hand different kind of arrest categories, but also downstairs there was a room for corporal punishment.
This camp was constructed for women by the male prisoners of Sachsenhausen. Most here were political prisoners. Between 1939 and 1945, the camp took in about 130,000 women to be used as slave labor. 90,000 of them died. Among the prisoners were the Ten Boon sisters, Corrie and Betsy, Dutch Christians who hid Jews during the war. You can find their names in the camp registry. Corrie survived Ravensbrück. Betsy died here.
These aren't necessarily all Jews. Yeah, these are sometimes. So okay. Doesn't always.
Many prisoners, like Hannah Kipe, kept diaries. which the museum here preserved. Hannah's entry for March 23, 1944. No sleep at night, in very bad condition. The women here were starved and yet were forced to labor all day in the on-site textile mill, making uniforms for German soldiers and munitions to support the Nazi war effort. The women often made sure to rig the machines so the socks were stitched improperly and would wear out faster.
And we know from Corrie ten Boom that she was able to smuggle in her Bible.
There were no religious services allowed here, but the prisoners improvised, holding services as they walked up and down the roads, preaching from memory of the scriptures. As we walk around here, I can't help but notice the trees. A little landscaping propaganda to make the sight of such horror seem somewhat normal to a vaguely interested outsider. I wish these trees could speak. What would they say? Could they even describe what they saw? Better they remain silent. Maybe no one would believe them anyway.
So, back at where they did labor, when they had forced labor and there was some textile things going on, there were some old exhibits that were just being stored there. So that was all of the statue-like things that they looked human, but they were created in a way that they almost look like these ghostly skeletons. And I think that's a reality for the women here and the men when they were here in the later years. That's the reality of what it is being in a concentration camp. And that's just a really stark image of it. I think art has a lot of power, so that really impacted me.
I like the ground is covered in these black rocks that symbolize like the dark sand that was there originally for the camp. But then within the rocks and like the foundation, there are indents to represent where like each buildings were, especially the barracks, those that aren't standing anymore. So I think it's fascinating to see how big it is with an open space, but then to see how many buildings there were and how many barracks there were, and then just to kind of realize how many prisoners there actually were at this camp itself, and then how they're able to reflect that with these black stones. It's really cool and fascinating.
I think something that stood out to me today was the way that they handled like pregnant women and just I guess the prisoners being women in general, like the way they kind of exploited them differently than like male prisoners, just like forcing them to like stand like bare naked and just kind of like take the comments from the guards and just like kind of like just being forced to be that much more kind of uncomfortable and exposed, and the way they dealt with pregnant women just kind of like choosing which babies they wanted to survive based on whatever they wanted, and just kind of like the inconsistencies with like abortion and just all of they didn't follow their own rules, and that just kind of added to everything that we've been learning about.
We're going to Krakow, about an 8-hour bus ride from Berlin. We have time for a little walking tour of old Krakow, with its beautiful castles and churches. But I feel a little guilty for acting like a tourist and enjoying myself. Then I remember the Krakow ghetto, where Jews were kept until deportation to Auschwitz. Part of the ghetto wall still stands. The wall was deliberately constructed in the shape of Jewish headstones, a message to Jews that no one gets out alive. I'm not sure any of us know how to act. We all know what's on the schedule for tomorrow. But let's enjoy another beautiful medieval city and try to pretend we don't know what's coming. There isn't much talking this morning. Maybe because we aren't sure what we're going to see or how we're going to react. Or maybe we do know. On the way, we see signs for Auschwitz. It's a Polish name. You might know it better by the name the Germans gave it. Auschwitz.
Und ihnen unermüdlich zuzurufen, die Juden sind schuld, die Juden sind schuld.
There are two camps at Auschwitz. Auschwitz I, the first and primarily a labor camp, and Auschwitz-Birkenau, an extermination center and the linchpin in the Nazis' so-called final solution. Much of Auschwitz I is still intact. The barracks and the building where the Nazis held their kangaroo court with space for a firing squad just outside. There were no fair trials here. Only a bullet to the back of the head. Very few people escaped from Auschwitz. About 900 or so tried, but fewer than 200 succeeded. Those who were unsuccessful were hanged, their bodies stacked on the corner as a warning to the other prisoners.
We're never taken to justice.
Auschwitz I had its own gas chamber with an adjacent crematorium, outside of which now stands the gallows from which Camp Commandant Rudolf Hess was hanged after the war. And then, the moment for which I was not prepared. Things taken from prisoners, preserved for us to see. A massive tangle of eyeglass taken from victims before they were gassed. Kitchenware. Prisoners thought they might need it for cooking. Prosthetics, braces, and crutches, and the luggage. All of those suitcases that contained everything the prisoners could carry. They were told they would get them back. And the shoes, a mountain of shoes, so many little ones. In another room, the Book of Names, the names of the dead, millions of names.
Światowej w całej Europie Niemcy zamordowali? Doskonale 6 milionów. To coś przed nami. Nie ma członków rodziny, nie ma sąsiadów, którzy mogliby potwierdzić, że...
At Auschwitz-Birkenau, many of the barracks are gone, though their chimneys stand, marking the landscape like monuments. This barrack has been preserved. These bunks held 5 or 6 adults. There was no running water or sanitation.
It wasn't uncommon for prisoners to wake up next to someone. And of course, many prisoners would ultimately die faster than even at Auschwitz I. We know the average life of a prisoner in Auschwitz I, in those better buildings, the water was cleaner there, it was gotten from a river next to the camp. The prisoners lived in Auschwitz I on average 6 months. Here, it was about 3.
Auschwitz-Birkenau is massive. It was a killing factory, ruthlessly efficient as prisoners packed in rail cars were brought here and either sent immediately to the gas chamber or ordered to work before they were murdered. With few exceptions, those sent to Auschwitz died. There are the ruins of the crematoria, monuments to mass murder dynamited by SS guards in attempt to destroy evidence. I wish it wasn't such a pretty day. At the back of the camp, next to another crematorium, we came upon a meadow with chirping birds, shade trees, and wildflowers. One member of our group called it God's Memorial. We spent about 8 hours at Auschwitz. It was both too much and not enough. I want to describe the experience, but I can't. I take a few notes, but for the most part, my pen is frozen as our group meets to discuss what we've seen. I need time. We all need time.
You guys sort of experienced perhaps the moral hinge of the 20th century. There were moral issues that we've wrestled with pre-Auschwitz, and then the Holocaust happened, and the whole new sort of way of thinking about what humans are possible of doing opened up at that point.
It's just like, you know, there's a deer outside today. It was a pretty scene, and like you look out there, and if you didn't turn around and look behind you, like it's the world we know, but we need to remember the fact that it was not that way.
that what we saw today on this beautiful day, I actually think it made it worse.
Because I was so angry. I was so angry all day. Like, I was so mad. Just so many different reasons, but I was just so upset. And the title of my journal was "It's Beautiful and I Hate It."
And anger, but then in the back of my mind, I'm thinking like, what am I to do with all this information that I'm gathering? Like, is turning it into anger really what's worth my time?
I don't know, it didn't feel real to me, which was, I don't like saying that, but it just felt like I was in this like set or like reconstruction of it, and I wasn't there. After 2 days of decompression in Krakow, we're headed home. I went on to this trip kind of, I think, expecting something, and it happened to be entirely different from what I thought it was. It was weird getting to Sachsenhausen and Ravensbrück. I thought I would feel way more just being hit with emotions, but it was more a lingering kind of feeling, just a feeling of darkness and kind of hopelessness. Getting to Auschwitz, that was really hard, really long, really hard mentally, physically, emotionally. I remember the one time that I broke down was seeing the luggage and just all of the names being on them. For some reason, it really hit me hard that, you know, not that I didn't think they were people before, but these were people, and just looking at like the brush strokes of their names and how they wrote them, it really kind of messed me up. And then going back into the field by the gas chamber of Auschwitz, seeing the memorials that were put on the site of where the victims' bodies were burned, it was a hard moment, but it was a beautiful moment, and it really made me realize that you grow up and you hear about the Holocaust in classes, history classes. It's kind of just another event of history that you memorize on flashcards for tests. But then once you're there, it's way more important to learn about it. It's way more important to know about it, because, you know, we don't want it to happen again in any other way, and it's really convoluted and hard to kind of get an idea of how it starts and how it'll progress. But I think if we really focus on being human and showing humanity, you know, we'll get to where we need to be in society. And sometimes you need to have uncomfortable conversations, or go somewhere uncomfortable, or be desperate or sad or hopeless or lonely. And you really need to feel those emotions and work through it to get to an end. And I think the Holocaust showed me emotions that I'm not used to seeing, and in a different way that I've been experiencing it, and it really broadened my perspective on everything that I've been taught and everything that I learned and everything that I will take from it from here on. So, in a day, I'll be back to living life as a college student, going through my day-to-day routine, which now seems more mundane than ever. People will ask me, how was it? What did you see? No answer seems adequate, but I can tell you that what I did see, I will see forever.